Now we get to the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, perhaps the most famous debates in American history, that took place in the summer of 1858. So Lincoln re-enters politics in 1854 as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, while Lincoln hated slavery, unlike the abolitionists, Lincoln was willing to compromise with the South to preserve the Union. But he was adamant on halting the expansion of slavery. Lincoln's critique of slavery and its expansion articulated the basic values of the Republican Party, the Northern Republican Party, and the millions of Northerners who voted for it. His life embodied the free labor ideology and the promise Northern society offered to working men, notably white working men. In 1850s Illinois, property-owning farmers, artisans, and shopkeepers still vastly outnumbered wage earners. Lincoln believed blacks should own their own labor and have every opportunity to improve themselves through their labor as whites. In other words, slavery was wrong because it did not allow black people to benefit from their own labor and potentially climb up the socioeconomic ladder and become an independent landowner. The free labor ideology that was advocated by Abraham Lincoln and his Republican Party, as well as a very large proportion of Northerners, was based on the assumption that free labor could not compete with slave labor, and so slavery's expansion had to be halted to ensure freedom for the white laborer. To quote Lincoln, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." The 1858 campaign against Douglas, and they were running for senator, and Lincoln loses. Lincoln was the add-on. Douglas was the celebrity at the time of these debates. Now, these debates went a long way towards making Lincoln a celebrity, and the 1858 campaign against Douglas made Lincoln nationally known. Lincoln insisted that the nation could not survive forever half slave and half free, and that Americans would have to make a choice as a nation and reject the idea of popular sovereignty Douglas advocated. So the main issue during the debates was slavery and popular sovereignty and slavery in the territories. The Lincoln-Douglas debates are classics of American political oratory. Conflicting definitions of freedom were at their center. Lincoln argued that freedom meant opposing slavery and that the founding fathers had set the nation on the road to eventual abolition of slavery. Now, that's definitely a candy-coated version of what the founding fathers thought, but it was a rejection of what Tawney argued they thought. It was the complete polar opposite of what Tawney argued in his Dred Scott case. The truth is probably someplace in between the two of them. Douglas argued, on the other hand, that freedom resided in local self-government and self-determination, and that each locality had the right to determine its own institutions. Douglas tried in the debates to portray Lincoln as a dangerous radical whose positions would degrade white Americans by reducing them to equality with blacks. Douglas argued that the U.S. had been created, quote, by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, close quote. Now, to be sure, Lincoln shared many of the racial prejudices of his day. For example, he opposed giving Illinois blacks the right to vote, and he endorsed colonization. Remember, this is the pre-Civil War Lincoln. We will eventually look at some quotations from Abe Lincoln, many of them during these debates, in which he was trying to be portrayed by Douglas as, quote, a black Republican, as somewhat of an abolitionist, which he decidedly was not. But Lincoln acted very defensive, and his quotes indicate that. Now, Douglas was only narrowly re-elected to the U.S. Senate. Elsewhere in the North, many Republicans did, in fact, win their elections. Moving on. Now we get to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. And again, we're getting closer to the Civil War. So John Brown was continuing his abolitionist ways, and he was different from many of the other abolitionists in that he was willing to use violence. So John Brown, apparently in an attempt to incite a slave insurrection, or perhaps to help some of them escape to Canada, he raids the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. He, some of his sons, some free blacks, and some escaped slaves, they raid the arsenal at Harper's Ferry in 1859. So the attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, led by John Brown, also increased sectional tensions. 3 years after his attack of slave owners in Kansas, in October 1859, Brown leads this interracial group of nearly 24 men in the attack at Harper's Ferry. Brown and his men were soon surrounded and all of them killed or captured by federal soldiers, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, the eventual Confederate officer. Brown faced a trial for treason and in the trial behaved admirably, earning through his trial the admiration of millions of Northerners, who nonetheless disapproved of his violent actions. So he became kind of like this troubled hero to Northerners. Brown's execution made him a martyr of Northern abolitionists, while Northern praise for Brown outraged and further alienated Southerners. It is difficult to overstate the effect this had on the psyche of the South, especially the slaveocracy. Now, post John Brown, when they viewed Lincoln, they saw John Brown. A growing number of Southerners began to think their region's future looked more favorable outside the Union than within it. Oh, and John Brown, right before he was hanged, promised the South that blood will be shed if that's what it takes to end slavery. And he proved to be right. So this would be a painting of the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry from 1835. So now we get to the 1860 presidential election. It was Abraham Lincoln for the Republican Party, John Bell for the Constitutional Union Party, John Breckinridge, Southern Democrat, the pro-slavery party, and Stephen A. Douglas, the Northern Democrat, the Party of Popular Sovereignty. Abraham Lincoln wins. So let's not forget the Republican Party platform in 1860, the one that led to the election of Abe Lincoln. Number one, they did not want slavery to extend into the territories and once they became states. They wanted a protective tariff for Northern industrialists. They wanted no abridgment of rights for immigrants. This was a disappointment for the Know-Nothing Party, the American Party. They wanted government aid to build a Pacific Railroad. Remember the internal improvements. And this was meant for the Northwest. They wanted internal improvements for the West and those moving west at federal expense, which remember meant taxes. And they also wanted free homesteads for the public domain for farmers. So if you move out west, you would get a homestead either for free or on the cheap from the U.S. government.